Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conversations in Pop Culture, where I have with me Andrew Guilde, the writer and creator of the comic book Man of Sin. So, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Really excited to talk shop.
Yeah, I'm excited too because this book's interesting. And before we go too deep into this book, a lot of people who are going to be watching this, whether it's live or on replay or after it's blessed out into a bunch of groups, might not know what Man of Sin is about and what the basic premise is about. So I think that's a really good place to start before we
Yeah,
dive too deep into it.
yeah, for sure. Madison's a psychological horror graphic novel. Um, it took me about, I don't know, maybe 5 years to complete. We started it, me and the artist Camilo Ponce, we started it back in 2015. We went to Kickstarter twice. Once was in 2016 to kickstart the first issue. And then again, there's a bunch of different. I mean, it's a pretty long and convoluted story. We could get into that later. But in 2019, we kickstarted the entire graphic novel, which was 4 issues. And what it's about, it is about a father. His name's Damian Nero. Uh, it's He wants the truth about his dead son. His son dies when we meet him right at the beginning, and he wants to find out the truth. He's kind of left with this big mystery of kind of what happened to his son. Why is his son dead? And the more he learns about it, the further he goes, the more into madness he finds himself. And so the big question in this is, what are you willing to do to get the truth? Are you willing to get the truth and lose madness and destroy everything, or are you satisfied with not knowing? And that was kind of my big question as I started writing this thing. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. There's a lot of other supernatural things going on, and a lot of mysteries and flashbacks and all that good stuff. I had a lot of fun writing it. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not that big of a book. It's very much a contained package. It's about 90 pages. And so before we dive into some of the mystery and diving deeper and looking under the hood of the car, for lack of a better word here, how did this idea even come about? Because it is something that's sort of a little bit different. There's elements of religion thrown in there that I'm sure we're going to talk about. It's also the madness, and there is questions on what is real, what isn't real with all of this and all that stuff. So how did all of this come about? Because it's not your typical story that's thrown out there.
Yeah, kind of came about in two different ways. The first seeds of this idea came about. I don't know. I was at home late at night watching the History Channel of all things, and you know those like really cheesy documentaries like Ancient Aliens and all that stuff. Um, One of them was about the Antichrist, and it was like all these professors talking about the Antichrist, and I was really as I was watching it, I was like, I think this is like if the Antichrist was real, like these guys are saying, like the Antichrist was real. I wouldn't think he'd be like a 35-year-old white guy with a suit and tie, like in the corporate world. He would have been, you know, a regular guy who grew up, and something would make him want to destroy the world if he knew he was the Antichrist. And so that was kind of the seed of that idea: is why would a normal person want to destroy the world or himself? And what evolved from that, and that was just floating in my head for a long time, and I did nothing with it. But really what happened was I lost my stepfather and my grandfather to cancer about 6 months apart from each other. And what I saw was my family kind of dealing with this grief. Like, how do we deal with it? And so what I found was that destroying the world kind of was a metaphor for what are we willing to do when tragedy hits us? How are we able to get over it? And so that's what, once those two kind of ideas kind of meshed, was like the destroying of the world is really what happens when we are faced with a tragedy, and how do we get over it? Do we let it consume us to where we destroy the world, meaning ourselves, what's around us? Do we let it eat us away? Or do we move on and try to make a new life for ourselves? And so once I knew I wanted to talk about trauma and tragedy, and this kind of like antichrist thing. I kind of fused them together, and Madison came out.
Yeah, let's talk about that because clearly the main character is Damien Nero, and the story is taking place in present day. It also takes place about a year ago and everything leading up to that year ago. And so, what was his conception of a character like? Because obviously, he has an okay life. There's struggles in his life in general. He's obviously not perfect, doesn't have the best family life, he doesn't have a horrific family life, but he obviously loves his wife, he loves his son. And then all of a sudden, he's drinking out with a friend. His wife gets into a car accident, and then his son goes missing, and he thinks he heard somebody's voice kidnap his son, and people don't believe him. So, what was that entire thing like? Because that obviously is the first sign of madness that kind of lights the fuse for everything else. So, how was that building all that out? Because there's elements of guilt in there, there's elements of responsibility or lack of responsibility in there and built in, and then that kind of is being relived over and over again in a variety of ways.
Yeah. So Damian Nero was when I first started thinking about him, I really wanted a guy that was like an everyday man. I wanted him to be kind of as down the middle as possible. I didn't really want a whole lot of I didn't want him to be extraordinary in any sense of the word, like in anything. I just wanted him to be like an everyday man. And the more I started kind of constructing who this guy was, and started thinking about the type of trauma I wanted to, to discuss and have him deal with, what I started finding myself thinking about was what happens when tragedy hits us? Who are we blaming? A lot of times when someone dies or something happens, right? A lot of the tears, at least this is what I found in my life and talking with my family, a lot of the tears and grief is that regret of what we wish we did when that person was around, or like these lost conversations that you didn't have, or if I could have done one thing differently, I would have done it, right? Like that's where all this emotion boils up from. Like very, obviously we miss them and they're gone, or there's that part of it, but a lot of the feelings and emotion comes from this like regret area. And so I was really, when I was building this up, I really wanted Damien to have this really big, deep seated kind of monkey on his back that he was wrestling with. Like he feels that he has to do these things, that he has to make these things right because he feels that it's his fault that things happened.
And to even add further to it, he's sort of drunk and drinking, and then he hears the phone ring, and his son obviously calls him, and then he hears somebody, mention his son's name. And so, what is that like? Because nobody is picking up on that. And then it raises the question, well, did he hear something? Did he not hear something? Did somebody call his son's name out? And so, what is that like? Because that's further adding to the guilt and also fueling the search because that's kind of the only lead. And even though everybody's dismissing that, he is not dismissing that. And we sort of get a sense in the book that that might be real, but we also get a sense in the book that it might not be real. So, what is that like? Because that's kind of the hook of him driving, and that fuels a lot of components. And you talk about seeking truth and finding truth and getting closer to the truth. So, what is that entire thing like? And really throwing that in there because that's the spark that kind of ignites everything off for the year. Because really,
Yeah,
throughout the entire year, we sort of see him going down this madness, and then the graphic novel only deals with the last 24 hours with all the flashbacks. If that makes
yeah.
sense to everybody out there.
It seems like a really convoluted book, like when you talk about it, but it reads. It doesn't. I hopefully it didn't read that convoluted. Like you have a, you know,
It's the idea that in many ways, the best way I describe it is that there's point A and point B take place within 24 hours, and we're getting all the backstory that is sort of thrown in there that takes place backwards. It is a really
yep,
good way to put it. So it's kind of like, I can't think of something off the top of my head so quickly, but
Memento.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Where all the background information, all the flashbacks provide a little bit more context to what's
Hmm.
going on and what's happening and why things are important versus what things aren't and the madness of it all.
Yeah, That's a great way to put it. It's better than better, more like concise than I was ever able to talk about it. Because when I talk about this, like when I go to cons and stuff, I'm like, well, he's seeing stuff, but he's not seeing stuff, and all that. And people just sometimes look at me, and I'm like, you just read it. Trust me, it's not as convoluted. It's just hard to talk about it without giving like everything away and all that stuff. Um, but as far as like what's going on when he hears that voice and why, there's kind of two things. Right? I'm an English teacher, so I really I love books and stories, and some of my favorite stories are the ones with unreliable narrators. And so I wanted to make a book that was nonlinear. I like nonlinear books as well, and stories for that matter. So I made a book that was nonlinear, so we could move through time, and it's an interesting story device and a story kind of mechanism, if you will. And then I wanted Damien to be unreliable, and I wanted his like what's going on with him to be unreliable, because I want people when they read this, I want them to have discussions. I want one person to read it one way and someone to read it another way, and I want them to have a discussion. And I really like if I feel like as a writer, I respect my readers enough that I don't want to force feed them the answers. I want them to come up with their own answers, come up with their own things. Let's discuss it. So that was one reason why I did it, kind of for Damien's purposes. When I'm sorry if you could hear my dog barking in the background. I apologize. Um, for Damien's purposes, right? Like he, whether or not that voice is real, I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. It's up to you. But for Damien, it has to be real for the simple fact that if it's not, he has to let go of this thing. He has to move on. And this is the only thing that's latching him to this, to the truth, right? He needs to find the truth for his own sake, right? Because he thinks if he finds the truth, everything will be better. He can make things right again. When in all reality, what we find in the later, at the end of the book is that you can't you can't undo what's done. There is no, once a tragedy happens, right? We could latch onto it and wish and hope and plead for it to all be better, but until we accept it and then and really deal with it, we can't ever move on. And so that was kind of the whole reason with this voicing and why he wouldn't let go. He's like a dog with a bone, right? Like throughout the whole thing, like he's not letting go of this thing. Like this, I gotta do it. I know it. You guys are missing something. I'm right. And it was just a lot of fun, going down that road
And
and playing with
then
that.
and then this ensues him to go crazy. So just to run a little bit of it, I don't think it ruins too much. Damien at a certain point sort of wants to commit suicide. And
Hmm.
he does, or he attempts to. And then he meets a character who says, "Hey, if you live for 24 hours, I'm going to tell you the truth, or you're going to find the truth." And then that empowers him to go along a path. And he's now going down, and he thinks people are attacking him. They may or may not be. That's for you to determine. He also figures out that certain people are not being honest with him, and he finds out other truths about his life, and that maybe he is not so crazy anymore. Maybe, when whether he hears this voice or not, which you sort of find out, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, and you start figuring out stuff that's happening with this, and that maybe certain people were lying to him this entire time for other motives. And so that's a fascinating entity, whether that entity is real or not, that tells him, obviously he starts experiencing and seeing a whole boatload of truth, not even involving his son, but almost his entire life. And so, what is that like? Because that kind of expands the comic in many ways to now saying, oh, I was not seeing what was out in front of me involving my family, involving the people around me, involving the people who were telling me what is real and why were they telling me all of this. And so, that's a fascinating entity that even expands more of, am I being lied to? Because that's what I got out of the entire book. And are people trying to protect me from something that is inside of me? And it raises questions if Damien is a schizophrenic in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
the entire book. And I'm having somebody on who writes also another comic dealing with that. And after reading that comic, for full disclosure, that thought came to me. So, what is that like to throw that out there and also throw that maybe, schizophrenic, maybe he's not. Because clearly there's a lot of stuff going on in here. And that character kind of awakens things. And maybe it's a demon? Just
Yeah.
to throw out a little hint there for everybody.
You know, I wanted it. You know, every time what's really interesting is every time he kind of his name's Mr. Lived. Every time he meets this guy, right? It's always in a pivotal point with him where he's, about to die or going to die. And really, what that was, it was, I really wanted to make a character and surround like if you took when you're going through a tragedy or you're going through something, right? The people around you a lot of times will tell you like it's going to be okay, right? And you don't want to hear that sometimes, right? Or they'll give you advice.
There's a
Uh,
great scene that people should know. There's a great scene with House and Wilson in House.
yeah,
And Wilson is talking about the social contract with House and how they don't have a social contract. And Wilson hasn't seen his brother for a while. And his brother ran away. His brother is like didn't has been on his meds, and then they found his brother at a hospital. And he's staying in a hospital in like a psych ward essentially. And everybody's saying to us, "No, it's going to be fine. Your brother's going to love you." And House just doesn't say anything like that. And the question is that what is the social contract in that? And that's kind of what this is in many ways. With
100%. Yep.
Mr. Liv is there's no social contract, and so when House at the end of the episode to ruin it for everybody, Wilson speaks to House, and Wilson says, "Oh, my brother doesn't hate me," and House says to Wilson, "No, that's disappointing," meaning that that's not something that no somebody normally would say, but hence
Hmm.
there's no social contract. So that's I think the best way how to put it.
Yep. I mean, I think you hit it right on the head, and I wanted to, and I wanted to explore that with, what would that mean to someone who is like a dog with a bone and wants to find, this truth. And um, the more we, and what's interesting too with this is that we're only getting the point of view of Damien for the most part, and so we don't know whether or not these memories are real. We don't know if these memories are.
It's a very
Um,
slanted view.
yeah, right. Like he sees these things, and what's what was really interesting, writing it and hopefully I hope the readers get it as well, is that he says everything. He starts seeing these things as lies, these memories as lies, but that's the way he views them, right? Like he's viewing them a second time, but through like a slanted lens, and so we don't know what to believe, what's real, what's not. And, you know, that tied in with all of his madness, how this is making him kind of go down this deep and dark rabbit hole was what was really fun. And, and I really enjoyed writing it. It was a lot of
And
fun.
then the flip side of that is Father David,
Hmm.
and how Father David is the exact opposite in many ways of Mr. Liv, and how Father David is sort of a reasonable person, or supposedly, and is reasonable to some degree back in David's memories, as well as during the present time. And certain things happen, and we obviously get a voice of reason from Father David throughout this entire thing with Damien, and how Father David sort of stops Damien from killing people to some degree, and how he's preaching to him, and how he's kind of being a light, but then Damien has a certain other view, and he shifted, and that entire slanted. And I'm trying to avoid exactly ruining it. It's a little bit hard, but obviously we have those conflicting positions now, where we have a certain, I guess, viewpoint, and almost the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. And Father David
Hmm.
takes the angel role, and Mr. Liv takes the devil role. And obviously Damien has some issue and tends to go down part of the devil role throughout this entire book in his actions and everything, how he's viewed them and what's led up to the flashbacks led up to what's going on and not being able to let go. And but Father David sort of stops that from going over the top to a degree. And so, what was that like to throw that character in there and then have that battle taking place? And obviously, there's something larger happening in the background with all of this. And in many ways, Father David and Damien are pawns in a much larger game as well.
Yeah,
And we could dive into that, but that sort of ruins certain things. And that's an aside that could be possibly done in a second book.
yeah. I wrote it. I wrote it. I mean, just to tackle that real fast, I wrote it. I really like almost like True Detective. I like self-contained stories that we could tell within the same universe, and so I constructed it as these set of characters are kind of are done. We're done with this, like Damien and all that, but they live in a much larger universe. So if it strikes me and Camillo to write a second volume, we could do that, and we could do it the way I set it up too. The way it's set up in the book, we could do it at any point in time. Like we could do one in like ancient Rome, or we could do one in the 20s. We could do it. It's all the mythology that's underneath all this kind of gives us a lot of wiggle room with what we could do. So yeah, we could definitely do a second book if we decide to. But this story, Damien's story, is kind of self-contained and done. To play around with like the Father David and Mr. Lib, I needed to have a sounding board for Damien's not what he says, but what he thinks and what he does, right? Because a lot of times people say things and they don't really mean it. And so I needed him to have a grounding mechanism, and that was kind of his memories with his wife, Father David, and his friend Jude. That's kind of like his grounding mechanism, like what's kind of real, what's the what's good, the things I should do. And this other guy that only he sees, or we think he's the only one who can see him, Mr. Live, is what he really wants to do, right? And so what's interesting is when you're playing around with that, it's almost like, all right, here's what I do every day. Here's society. Here's the way I conduct myself out in the open. But here's what I'm really thinking. Here's what I really want to do. And so that's what I was messing around with. And then by the end of the book, it's almost there's some flippage going on there when we see kind of Damien kind of
Yeah.
wanting to end it all.
And we kind of get a situation with Damien, Mr. Liv, and Father David where the ends justify the means and decisions are made on all three of their parts, mostly Damien and Father David. And that's something that is very interesting in this book where we get that idea where Damien believes in a lot of things where the ends justify the means and whether he believes it, whether it's accurate or not, doesn't really matter at this point in the story. And then Father David makes a choice, or supposedly makes a choice, because we don't fully know, because it's from one vantage point. But it could be very much interpreted that Father David makes a choice that also is an ends justify the means choice. And so I like stories that do that. I like that entire concept as a theme of a book in general, where the ends justify the means and dealing with decisions that have massive consequences, but we need to do something in order where certain people need to pay a price and make a sacrifice for other things. And for Damien, in many ways, he does what he does, and it's almost at the end he gets some type of peace
Hmm.
with his choice, and Father David also gets some type of peace in the choice he makes, or supposedly he makes, because we don't fully know. So, what was that like, having that all tidied up and having it somewhat resolved?
Yeah,
Not a happy ending, but a resolution.
yeah,
Because you're an English teacher, so you have to know that when books have no good resolution, it's just miserable. Same thing with movies.
yeah. I personally, I don't like the super tidy happy endings. They're a nice. they're nice when they happen, but when I was writing this, I realized early on that it wasn't going to, spoil alert, it wasn't
But
going
you
to
needed a
end.
resolution in which
Yeah,
because
it wasn't.
there are books that have no resolution, and
Right.
that's not a good ending. First thing,
Correct.
you could have a miserable ending, but if you have a resolution, that makes complete sense as a writer.
Hmm.
Versing books that have no resolution and that tidy endings are great and happy endings are great, but non-resolutions are not endings to books. And this has a resolution, which is something
Yeah.
that I liked a lot
Oh,
for what it
thank you.
was.
I when I when I wrote it, like I was saying, I knew the choices Damien made and what was really driving Damien. He was kind of going down a path that he had to go down, and once he went down that path, it was almost like there was no return for him. And I'm really into tragedies. I teach a lot of old Greek plays and Shakespeare and stuff, and there's a lot of tragedy uh, in those, and I kind of wanted to have kind of a almost a traditional tragic ending, a Julius Caesar type ending, if you will, where you know when once you make a decision and you make a decision based on the what you think is best for everyone around you, it's not like a good decision, right? Like Father David, what he ends up doing and what he discloses to Damien at the end, which kind of like kicks the ending off. He thinks he's saving the world by doing this. Like he thinks he's helping everyone. And if I have to hurt one person to save the world, that's an easy equation for Father David.
The needs of one do not outweigh the needs of the world.
Yes. And so that was what I was playing with that. But then I also wanted to look at, well, what happens to that one person that you screwed over? How do they deal with that? And that was kind of Damien, uh, from the vantage. Like we never see that story, right? Like there's a lot of stories where you say, all right, the ends justify the means. What happens to the person who's the mean? Like what happens to that guy, right? And so that's kind of what Damien's story was. When you end up with that guy, um, who gets the short end of the stick, what are they going to do? And so that was kind of me exploring that as well.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where that ends and that goes. And I don't want to ruin too much about what happens, but I do want to talk about one more thing with this book before we talk about the Kickstarter on the other side of this. And the nice touch about this book is that the color palettes are dark in many ways. The flashbacks. Wow, I can't speak today. Are in black and white for the most part, and that's kind of a nice touch and it's a nice differentiating factor. And so, how did all of that come about, and what was that like, and what was it like throwing that out there? Because that really adds some character to the book, and it adds a nice little touch. I don't know how much you had input into that, or if that was your artist's idea, or if that was the intention, or it just worked. Because the book is in color for those who don't know, but obviously the flashbacks are very much in black and white.
Yeah. So there's a bunch like that went into the making of this. So first off, my artist on this book, his name's Camilo Ponce. Camilo, you're the guy. If you ever listen to this, I love you. You're the man. Um, he's an amazing artist. I would put his skills as an artist up against anyone. He did the line work, he inked it, and then he hand water painted every page. Like this was a labor of love for him. And I you know I am so lucky to have worked with him. Like I could see I could see him one day working like at the big two. Like he's that good. I got really, really lucky to work with such an amazing artist. And so right away we were having conversations. Like this is a horror book, right? But there's nothing that Camilo could draw that would, when you looked at it, would scare you. There's not one thing he could draw, especially this day and age when we're so desensitized. You might look at it and go, "Oh, this is gross," or "This makes me feel uncomfortable," but it won't scare you. And so we had an idea early on that what we wanted to do is we wanted to make this book. It's a psychological book. It's going on in your head. We wanted the readers to feel stuff, right? We wanted it to be sticky. We wanted it to stay with you. And the only way we could do that in this visual medium, right? Because like we don't, it's not a movie, right? And a lot of jump scares happen when like the sound goes up. We don't have any of that. So how can we influence emotions with all of you? And as an English teacher, right, I know, colors and different things like that can influence people. So right away, um, Camilo, me and him talked about how we wanted the reader to feel. And depending on where we wanted the reader to feel, which very much ties into Damien's own feelings, the color palette changes. So we'll go from this like light blue wash in the beginning to a deep dark red, and it moves kind of back and forth depending on the mood that Damien's in, but also the mood we want our reader to feel and connect with. The black and white pages, we wanted it to be, first off, we because we're moving so far with time, like it's super nonlinear, like things
It's
move in.
easy also on the reader to figure out that black and white is flashbacks because
Yes.
movies have created that for us automatically. So it was
Mhm.
very easy as a reader to understand, oh, this took place in the past.
Correct.
And so we know that this took place in the past as a fact. And that's kind of one of the only facts we know of this book in reality when we're reading it is that, and I'm assuming on that one, but I think it's a safe assumption when we're in a bar and it's black and white. Obviously, we're in the past now versus the present. And so that's something that I thought was very nicely done. And then obviously the color palette definitely helps as well, figuring out how we're even getting closer and how things can be laid upon each other. Because there's a few pages like that that almost the past and the present integrate with each other, and
Yeah.
so and things like that. And then we also get certain things, and I think there might be some stuff in the past that's also done in a little bit of color, which reflects the mood as well, which is also a nice touch. But you still know it's in the past.
Correct. Yeah. Well, first off, we wanted. I love that you said it mixes with the past because that's what Damien is fighting with, right? And so, like right in the beginning, when we start seeing the beginning of the flashbacks, it starts to kind of bleed together, and it starts to lose its color before you get to the flashbacks. So, like the reason why we did that was one, we wanted to show that Damien's life is intertwined with his memories, like what's affecting him today is what happened before. Like this is all kind of connected. And it also was an easy way for us to transition the reader, like, hey, we're going to be doing this all the time, so you better get ready. So it was, it was a lot of fun. Camilo is an absolute just 1000% master. I don't if I would have tried this with any other artist, I don't know if the results would have been the same. Like very much what makes this book unique and makes it what it is Camilo's art, his ability to kind of change his color palette at will. Like he's just phenomenal. He definitely elevated the story.
And so now I think we're going to table there because I think if we continue to go any further talking about this, we're going to ruin a lot of stuff. And what happens, I'm going to ruin a lot of stuff too because I could tell you exactly what goes on, but you should really pick up this book. But let's talk a little bit more inside baseball with the Kickstarter and everything. So obviously, the first issue of this was funded on Kickstarter,
Hmm.
and this is a 90-page book. So I don't know how big that first issue was, but and there's a lot of stuff going on with crowdfunding right now. There's a big crowdfunding war that's sort of taking place between Indiegogo and Kickstarter. Obviously, you said it was 2015, so I don't know what the indie comic scene was like more in 2015 and Kickstarter. It's a lot more interesting now in 2020, and it's a lot
Hmm.
more self-respected. So, what made you choose to go with Kickstarter versus Indiegogo for starters?
Uh, yeah, a couple things. So right when we uh, I guess I'll just go in the whole long kind of story of Man of Sin. So I started writing Man of Sin probably about 2014 when I wrote the first issue, and I had two other artists attached before I found Camilo. The first artist I paid and he ghosted me, so that was and this was the first kind of the first comic book that I wrote, and so it was kind of trial by
It
fire.
was
I didn't
also
really,
the Wild West back in 2014, more so
yeah,
than nowadays, where the community, for those who don't know, and I have to say this because I'm part of it in a lot of ways. I know a lot of people who've had similar experiences. Back in 2014, it was much more like the Wild West, and it wasn't a accountability wasn't the word being thrown out there. Now, if you get ghosted in the right groups, 20,000 people, everybody knows everybody, and everybody's gonna blast it around, and that artist is gonna get no work, or that writer is gonna get no work, or they're gonna be bothered and harassed. And I'm not gonna tell anybody what to do, what not to do. That's not my job. But I do want to clarify that's what it was back in the day.
Yeah, and you know what? As a young writer, I finally took the plunge to create something, and it was a learning curve. Like I should have known better. Like I really like this guy's artwork, but really he was just the first person that said yes to me, right? And I wasn't thinking about the book or like what the book would look like. I was just concerned because when you're getting into comics, one of the biggest hurdles for writers is finding someone to draw your shit, right? Like that's the biggest hurdle
Mm-hmm.
is finding the first person. So unless you have unlimited amount of cash, right? Like someone who says yes to you, you're like, okay, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So this guy said yes to me. I didn't pay him a ton of money. Like it wasn't a lot. But the fact that he just kind of ghosted me, I was just like, you know what, I'll wash my hands. So I went and found another artist. This one, I vetted more. I did more of my homework, and he did the first 6 pages. And um, he was just like, hey, I gotta feed my family. I gotta get a graphic design job. Like I can't do unless this gets picked up by a publisher. I can't do this anymore. So I'm like, I totally get that. So I sent it out, or before that. So I'm like, all right, I don't have this guy. I sent it out to every publisher that would take submissions. Didn't hear. All of them got rejected. Got rejected by all of them, and it didn't look right. It was a different style, right? It was more cartoony. It was a whole different style. Um, so then I was like, all right, I really believe in this book. I really wanted this book. I'm going to give this one more chance. So I sent out like a open blast, like, will someone please work with me? Like I pitched everything was going on, and Camilo, the story really resonated with him, and he reached out to me and was like, hey, I want to work on this book with you. And the funny thing about Camilo was at the time I was already a fan of his. Like I found his work and I would follow his work. And at that time, Instagram wasn't really big; it was only DeviantArt, and I would just follow whenever he would post stuff up on that. And so I already knew who he was, and so I was kind of floored that my message board posts all over this guy that I was already a fan of wanted to work with me. And so we started putting it together with his work on it now, and I sent some more pitches out, got rejections, but then I got a rejection letter with an actual note to it, and it was from Top Shelf, and they were like, "Hey, man, this book looks amazing. It has a lot of merit, but it's not for Top Shelf. What you should do is go to Kickstarter and kickstart this book because we really want to see, we really want to see what happens with it." And I was like, "What's Kickstarter?" And so then I went down the Kickstarter route. I was like, what the heck is this? And I found what the Kickstarter was. And I really liked it. I didn't even know what Indiegogo was at the time. I don't know if it was as big as Kickstarter or had a big profile back then. So I was on board with the Kickstarter, and I decided to kickstart it in 2016. We completed the entire first issue. So it was just the printing of the first issue. That actually led me to get picked up by a literary manager out, you know, out in Hollywood doing scripts and stuff. So I took a 2-year hiatus to develop stuff in Hollywood. Um, Once that was done, I like right at the end of my time with that, I I got an opportunity to get published by Insane Comics, which was a kind of a smaller indie publisher out here in Illinois. It was out in Rockford, and they picked up Man of Sin in 2018, and we released issue 1 and issue 2. And right when we were about to release issue 3 in 2018, they closed their doors. They were like, you know what, we can't do this anymore. So they shut down. So we were without a publisher again. And we had a bunch of fans like, hey, can you finish this book? Like, I'm really invested in this thing. Where's this going? And so I just asked Camilo. I was like, Camilo, do you want to go to Kickstarter again and finish this book? And he's like, yeah, let's do it. And so we went back to Kickstarter in 2019, and it successfully funded. We got the book out, and here we are. It's a very long and convoluted
So let's
kind
let's
of
talk a little bit
story.
about that. So issue one is successful on Kickstarter. A lot of cool stuff is out there. Then you go back for issue two. And so obviously Kickstarter in many ways is a crowdfunding social media platform now. And so you were building fans. I think you gained some people between issues one and two. I think the Kickstarter did better on issue two. More people were invested, from my understanding, and looking back on it. And so, what was that entire thing like? Really having a successful Kickstarter, having another one, growing your audience, getting more people interested in your comic book, and having people saying, "Hey, we want to see where this is going." Just on the first two issues, for starters.
Yeah, so we only kickstarted the first issue, and then the second Kickstarter was for the whole graphic novel. But uh, my first Kickstarter, I had no audience whatsoever, and so I started from scratch. And so what I had to learn to do kind of on the fly was be my own marketer and be my own like publicist, and having to go out and figure out how to get get on podcasts, figure out how to get interviews, figure out reach out to comic book media like websites that do reviews and get my book into people's hands. So that was it's a steep learning curve, and it's not something that like I necessarily like internally am designed to do, right? Like I'm more of a creative guy. Like I don't like to do that stuff. It's not really in my wheelhouse, but you have to do that if you want to be creator. And nowadays, really, there's no if you want to create something, you just go and create it. It might be a steep learning curve. You might have to wear a bunch of different hats, but you could do it, right? Nothing's really standing in your way. And so for me, after that first Kickstarter, I had a good little mini like fan base. I had a group of readers. What I messed up at was when I took that detour into Hollywood and started developing that stuff, doing screenplays and spec scripts and all that stuff. I just left them kind of hanging for 3 years. The great thing about just the indie comics community and my fans and the readers was that when I came back, they were right there, eager and wanting to do that, and wanting to stay on board. So without them, this book wouldn't have been possible, and I wouldn't be here. So like, just once you get a little bit of readership and people that like your stuff, just keep going with that. It's like a snowball, right? It might not be big at first, or like like an avalanche. It might not be big at first, but the more you keep going, the bigger it becomes.
And then what was it like to come back and do the entire graphic novel and complete that story and give people what they wanted? Because now you had a successful Kickstarter. Obviously, you took a little bit of a break. Issue two and issue three was supposed to come out. Issue two came out through an indie um, comics publisher, and then issue three was supposed to. That didn't happen. And then you did the graphic novel, and obviously people wanted this story. And so graphic novels are a big thing now. Prior 20 years ago, nobody thought a graphic novel would be the first comic that people read. And now a lot of people are come to cons and they have a trade paperback and like, hey, this was my first comic that I've read. And so that's kind of very much a new norm that
Hmm.
started to appear, and it's going to be appearing a lot more for those who don't know. It's going to be a trend that comes out, and I'm calling it right now. And I'm not the first person who said this. I'm probably one of the last people to say it. But if you haven't recognized it, just a PSA. It's just a PSA to every creator out there that graphic novel format is the way to go. It's coming. But what was that entire thing like? Because that's a little bit different than the comic issue wise, where you now have more of a complete story. You're not breaking it up into issues. And so, was there like reformatting and maybe a little bit modification on it? Because now you don't have to worry about, oh, I have to make 24 pages.
Yeah. So we had what was it, 50 50 something pages of the first two issues already done. We had a little bit of issue three done because it was supposed to come out, but it wasn't finished. Um, and really putting it together, it's a one thing I want to tell all creators that I didn't know that I wish I did know, right, is that once if you're a writer and you want to write something and you get an artist to draw it, you still have to like figure out how the files together. You have to figure out how to get it to the right format to get it to the printer. You got to make sure everything's right. So like you're also kind of like a I don't know, like a project manager as well, which again I wasn't ready for. So I had to figure out how to do all that stuff. And what when me and Camilla were talking about bringing the story back and finishing it, we were like, well, issue 1 and 2 were already released, right? One was released on Kickstarter and it was published by an indie publisher. 2 was released. I was like, do we just release issue 3, or do you want to just finish this story, man? And he was like, let's just finish the story. Like, we're almost done. Let's get it done. And that's what people want. People wanted the end of the story, the resolution. They wanted to figure out what was happening. And I think if we would have just went issue 3 or kickstart issue 2, we wouldn't have had, as the success that we had, because we were, completing this thing that it took us 5 years to complete, from start to finish. And so, yeah, it was, and now it feels great. I've had this, I'm moving on to other stuff. Like it's my baby. I love it, but it's my firstborn. But I'm glad it's out in the world. I
And
don't got.
then
I feel like an empty nester now. I'm like, hey, get out of here, go
and then
flourish.
to talk about that too, because obviously publishing a comic book in a comic book, and I don't even mean a graphic novel, because a graphic novel is very different than a comic book, a trade paperback, which is what Man of Sin is. Now that your second Kickstarter, so it's obviously got a different binding. It's got a thicker binding. It's got a more, you know, I guess book binding is the correct word versus staples
Hmm.
binding. I'm sure there's a better technical word for it. I'm sure of it, and I'm sure that I'm going to get shit for it. But that's all right here. So what was that entire process? Because that's a very different printing process than a comic book.
Yeah,
And
I went with a publisher that did both. Um, and really, the publisher really worked with me. I'm so green and don't know what I'm doing. I'm kind of making it up as I go along, and figuring out what I need to do to get it done. Um, and so, really, what the biggest hurdle that we had with this book was the way it's designed, with the flashbacks and everything. We had to make sure that when we put it all together, it would read and flow nicely. And we didn't. One thing we could have done was like break it up almost into chapters and put like pinups in between, like the different where the issues would end normally. And then after me and Camila were talking and like what we wanted our book to be, we're like, all right, like I really want it to be something that you could read from start to finish. There's no chapters.
the one
it's a
shot.
yeah, right, like very large one shot. Um, and I didn't want there to be chapters. There's obviously kind of some natural breaks in there because they were issues, and they're natural story breaks. And so when you move on to the next page, it might feel like a different point in the story, but it's not like a hard issue break. It's not a chapter. And so we had to mess around with some pages. So like issue 1 and issue 2 in the floppy format read different than the graphic novel. And if we would have released issue 3 and issue 4, they would have read different too. The nice thing about this story, the way it's constructed, was I was able to move around some of the pieces as far as like the flashbacks and the flash forwards and all that stuff, and still tell a cohesive story the way I wanted. But if someone has the issue 1, the floppy, and opens up the graphic novel, there are differences in how it's told a little bit. So that's kind of a nice Easter egg. Like one day I would love a fan to come and find that. But so we had to mess around with that because you know when you turn the page, we wanted it so it was nice and easy to read and digestible, and like you weren't thrown off. Some of the things, the way we had it in the floppy form, wouldn't have done that. So I had to shift some things around, but it worked out. And I think the comic's better for that, right? The graphic novels probably better for that.
And so, what is that like for you? And I think you answered part of it, to be able to go back and revise something and make improvements upon it and make it so that it's a better reading experience. Because in the
Yeah.
indie sector, sometimes you get to do that, sometimes you don't. I've interviewed people who have gone back to their works 20 years ago, and one of my favorite writers and artists, the guy who did Polar, which I love. Polar, for those who don't know, was a web comic without any words. and he basically deconstructed the entire thing. Victor Santos, I believe, is his name, and then he rebuilt the entire thing. And it's on Netflix. The movie, it's a great movie. Please go check it out. It's like it's done in Happy style. The show Happy, it's done in that same style. That entire show and that movie. So great, 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 and he's just an amazing creator. And but what is that like? Because obviously you didn't deconstruct everything, but you definitely moved things around that made it a
Yeah,
better experience.
yeah, yeah. Polar is great. A great reference too. It was is that Mads Mikkelsen? Is he in it? Is he in the Netflix?
Mad something guy who plays with Chief in Battle Casino Royale.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
can't think of his last name. He also plays Hannibal
Yep,
in
yeah. It's
the
Mads
three
something.
seasons. He's great.
Yeah,
He's great.
yeah,
He's
awesome.
an amazing actor.
Yeah, it was a good movie. Yeah, it was it was a little it was frustrating because as like I didn't want to kill my darlings. I didn't want to I was really afraid of ruining something that worked so well. But for what I had to do was make sure that the overall product was the best it could be and was right. And in order to do that, I had to move some things around. I had to cut some things. In the Kickstarter, I gave away the scripts to all of them, and they'll see the differences if they read the scripts, the difference to what's actually printed up. And it was nice too to get to make sure that the story was right. Making sure that we had the best story in front of us. So that was nice. And since I'm the one doing everything, I get to control that, right? It probably would have been different if, a publisher had it and they were putting it together. They might have left it the way it was. I don't know. So yeah, it was nice to do that. And it was nice to, finally see it out into the world.
Yeah. Now let's change gears because we're gonna make a hard chapter break here. I do want to talk about COVID. You brought up some con stuff.
Yeah.
You were going to cons. I don't know how many cons you've gone to. I don't know your full experience. And I've gone to a lot of conventions as a panelist and as a guest and as a spectator. And so I'm just curious because the con world has been legitly knocked on its side of its head, flipped upside down, shaken, and everything is still settling down. With it, obviously San Diego Comic Con was canceled, New York Comic Con was canceled, a variety of other cons have been postponed, and they're canceled, and everything in between. All these virtual cons are appearing. So, how have you been affected by COVID for starters, as far as comic work goes, and promoting books and getting attention to your book? Because now everybody's online.
Yeah. I think everyone was initially very worried that, especially like the Kickstarter community, was worried that because of COVID um, and what's going on, that there would be less people, less eyes, or less people wanting to buy comics. But I think we're seeing that. I don't have the stats in front of me, but again, just the eyeball test. I feel like there's a lot more traction now because people are online. And this what Kickstarter is kind of becoming. If you're on Kickstarter now, there's two really big projects up. One is by Scott Snyder, the one who writes,
Oh,
Scott Snyder, the Batman. Scott Snyder. He's releasing a book on Kickstarter, um, and also Keanu Reeves, of all people, has a book up on Kickstarter. Right. So these are two huge heavy hitters that are on Kickstarter alongside all of these kind of, for lack of a better word, indie books. And really, what I think Kickstarter is starting to become, the crowdfunding, it's becoming the new normal. It's kind of becoming the comic shop, or like a a never ending con, like a comic book convention. It's kind of morphing kind of into that because of, like you said, we have no more cons. Um, I was just starting to get my footing on cons. I did one in I did Comic Con Revolution in 2019, and I was going to set up a bunch of cons for 2020, and I was getting the ball rolling on that. And obviously, they're not there anymore. It hasn't affected me all that much personally, as far as like I don't derive a bunch of my sales from that. Um, but I know a lot of creators, they're still struggling with it. And, my heart goes out to them. I think we're going to see um, a lot more Kickstarter stuff from bigger names because of that. Because I think it also hurt like the brick and mortar shops too, right? With that, like um,
So
indie
I'm going to
comics.
challenge you on that because a lot of these brick and mortar shops were actually saved
Mm,
because no new comics were coming out because
mm-hmm.
they got to get rid of their backlogs.
Yeah, that's true
And
for
so a
sure.
lot of shops actually reduced their backlogs by anywhere from 25 to 45%, which has never ever happened. And it hasn't, it's happened before, but it hasn't happened in almost 30 years. And
Yeah,
so a lot of shops actually are running low on inventory because of it. They have the exact problem that's a good problem where they would have like 50 long boxes and now they only have 35 of them. And so they went through, you could imagine 4,500 comics in a matter of 6 months. And now they have space for other things to take on new collections and things like that. So, in that regard, a lot of comic shops, the ones that survived and didn't have to close down, were actually saved. And so, because they got the ability to get rid of their backlog through a variety of channels. And so, actually, not being bombarded really helped them because now people are like, oh man, I want to pick up, a series of Civil War, for instance, the first 7 issues of Civil War, and it's in somebody's backlog. And that's just the first thought that comes to my mind. Or I want to pick up books from, 5 years ago. And so, a lot of shops, and I've spoken to a few of them, have gotten rid of a huge amount of backlog and they're like, now, oh man, now I really want to, buy collections, and I need to stock up again on backlog. So to some degree, a lot of shops have benefited, but still benefited how exactly? It's not good that foot traffic isn't there,
right.
but it did get rid of some of the inventory, which is a good thing. And so that leads you to my next question because you brought up Scott Snyder. I mean, Charles Soule and Ryan Brown just did
Mm-hmm.
curse words, and I enjoyed that. And I thought for $80, it's pretty good to get all the issues in a hardcover. Get the digital LP that Charles Soule is going to be singing, which is going to be amazing. Charles just has an amazing voice, Oscar winning. I'm going to make a pitch here. I think it's the Oscars that are the music. Or maybe we'll
Grammys.
submit it to the
Yeah.
CMTs, Country Music Awards. The CMA. I think we could get it in there, sneak it right in. I don't know Charles, so he'll be just as shocked as I am. He'll be shocked. I'll be dismayed. It'll work out perfectly fine. But I am curious about it, and I know that you're not as familiar with Kickstarter. But how do you feel about all these big names coming out to Kickstarter? Because Kickstarter and even Indiegogo, and I'm going to be speaking to Mindy Wheeler, who just launched a her own. Her and her husband launched something called Indie Crowdfund, and we're going to be talking about that on Tuesday. And she might be watching and yelling at me for spoiling some stuff here, but obviously there is some discontent in the comic community with a bunch of these big guys coming in. I think Kickstarter is for everyone, but I also understand that it's a little annoying when, certain big people who have the money or have the big name come in and start stealing away from the indies guys and all that stuff. So I don't know how you feel exactly about that, or if you just don't have enough experience in it,
No,
given that you're not all that on Kickstarter. You haven't done like 30 projects on Kickstarter yet.
I've done two, and I support a
It's
ton of.
tricky. It's tricky because, sorry to interrupt, but it's obviously a very hot button issue because I think, my opinion is that I think Kickstarter is for everyone. And I
Mhm.
think Kickstarter is for everyone beyond comics too, because I think people also forget in this community that it's not just comics that are on Kickstarter. Technology's on Kickstarter. Books are on Kickstarter. My dad just supported a photography book on Kickstarter. There's other stuff on Kickstarter. There's like new technology. Todd McFarlane did a toy on Kickstarter. So it's not just comics, but there is a concern right now in the market where you have people who are coming in who are coming out from DC and Boom Studios with Keanu Reeves, and I think it's great if you're a Keanu Reeves fan or you're a Scott Snyder fan, but at the same time you're like, wait a second, this celebrity's now coming into my home a little bit, and this was built by Indie for Indie and Indie built Kickstarter, and now you guys are sort of coming in and taking some of that market share away from us, but you're also bringing us market share at the same time and verification. And so it's a very tricky balance.
The way I see it, I've been on Kickstarter twice. I've successfully funded. I support tons of creators on Kickstarter. And like you said, I have I have some really cool watches that I got from Kickstarter. I support this watch company. They make really cool watches and they're very affordable. So I buy a lot of a
Is it a
couple watches from them.
Vincero?
Yeah, I don't have them on. But uh, to what do I think about the big guys coming to Kickstarter? Me personally, I love it. As a creator, as someone who puts something on Kickstarter, there's two things. Well, there's a couple things that Keanu Reeves and Scott Snyder and Todd McFarlane and Charles Soule, what they're doing. They're number one, they're legitimizing it to the larger mainstream comic book world, right? They're legitimizing this. They're getting new people into the ecosystem that normally wouldn't be there. And right, the hardest thing on a Kickstarter sometimes is you're like, hey, I got a Kickstarter going on. Like I was at a convention while my Kickstarter was going on, selling my book, the first issue of Men of Sin, while the graphic novel was on. I was like, hey, and if you want the rest of this book, it's on Kickstarter. And some comic book fans, these are big comic book fans at conventions, were like, what the heck is Kickstarter? So it's bringing more of those fans in, right? Number two, I don't know about other creators, but when you're on Kickstarter, it's almost like a virtual comic book store. Seeing my book right next to Keanu Reeves or my book right next to Scott Snyder, that's pretty dang awesome. That means we're the same. Just because you're already established and people know you doesn't mean that, I'm any less talented as the new guy on the block, right? And so I think there's this crab in the bucket mentality where a lot of indie creators are like, well, they don't need it. I need it. They're taking away, like, if someone's going to back a Keanu Reeves book, they're they weren't, they might not have backed your book anyway, so you're not losing that customer. If anything, that person is now in the ecosystem and you have access to them that you might not have had access before. And to put to your point about Charles Soule and the Curse Words book, right? That's like what was it, like 100 and something, 200-page hardcover book that,
796 pages.
okay, I was way off. Almost
It's
800
I'll put the math out there. So if Image was to do that, it's I think 32 issues. Image does books, and they've done Saga, and then Saga they've done the first 50 issues of Saga over. Or it might be 52 issues. It's 18 issues a position. Saga, no, first 54 issues. My math is off too, so don't worry about it. But it's over the course of 3 books, and each of those books is $50. So if they were to do curse words and Image was to do curse words, it'd be about $100 for 2 books on it. The book cost 80 to produce it, 85 for like a little sketch card included. So I'm saving on Kickstarter about $20 to $15 instead. So it's not like I'm saving all that much money with that production of that book if Image was to do it. But nonetheless, I'm also getting first shot at it, and also I'm getting my book name in there in like the thank you page, which is going to be cool because it's my company name, and I should have put the TM next to it, but that's a different discussion.
the what's cool is they couldn't have done this book normally, right? And that's what this Kickstarter stuff is. Like Scott Snyder, Noctera, right, is not going to be a normal book, and no one would publish it. So he comes to Kickstarter giving you something that they normally couldn't publish. I think I'm not a backer on the Keanu Reeves one, but I'm thinking they're like 3 different volumes, something that's they're not releasing to the direct market, and I think it's a really
So with
cool
with
and
with
interesting.
Keanu Reeves' book, I think it will be released to the direct market eventually.
Yeah,
I just think that they're using Kickstarter in many ways, and I think this is the gripe with that book in particular, is that Boom can do this without Kickstarter. I really think they can. I think they've made the anticipation that Kickstarter is going to raise a bunch of money, and there's a bunch of. And I was on a podcast and I said the exact same thing, where they're going to raise a lot of money that's going to fund this book and also fund other books, pay the artist team well, and it's going to keep some of Boom's other books afloat with the excess money associated with it. And there's tons of rewards, and it's getting tons of press, and it also looks really, really cool. It's also in association that Bill and Ted just came out. The Keanu Reeves book is a reasonable jab and discussion because there is a lot of promotion position around it. I think with Nocturna or whatever Scott's book is, I think to some degree there's a little gripe about it because it's Scott Snyder, it's Batman. He's doing a lot of independent books like no New Country or New Country and all that stuff, and so that's the issue with Scott. But I think that it's a harder argument. I think with the Keanu Reeves position, it's a lot of press is what Kickstarter gets, and I think that's the gripe with it is that there's a reason why Boom is doing it because it is going to be released eventually to the public. This is just a way for them to fund that project and also test the market, which I think is great in a lot of ways. And I think all the fans who want to buy this book, I'm happy for them, and I'm not against them doing it. But I do think that discussion has to be thrown out there, and there has to be a reasonable position. I spoke about this for like a good 5 minutes on some of these podcasts last Tuesday, and that's how I felt about it. And I think it's great, and I think it's smart. And if this Keanu Reeves book with Boom, they raised $200,000. They only need 80,000. They pay the artist team well, and then on top of that, what they do is that they then go and it keeps other books afloat. I don't have a problem with it per se.
Yeah, no, I'm all on board. I'm all for it. I think it's good
I think
for
the free market will determine what is
yeah.
acceptable and what is
You,
not.
you know, if these books bring new customers to Kickstarter, I'm the little guy. I'm the guy that the people that are mad that they're on the platform, like, hey, this is for indie creators. I'm that creator, and if I'm one that's like, I think this is great. I really do because it legitimizes my projects and it legitimizes other people's projects and it brings more people into the ecosystem, which is healthy for everybody. I think it's a win-win. I'm not really worried. Like they're not. It's not sucking the life out of Kickstarter. If anything, it's helping keep it going.
I agree for a lot of it. I think the Boom thing has left somewhat of a bad taste in certain people's mouths because I think it feels a little too promotional, and
Oh,
I think that is a little bit of saying like, I feel like it's just a little too much, where it kind of feels a little too commercial. If that makes any sense, and I think it's. I don't think the argument with Charles Soule or Curse Words or Scott's book or Jeff Lemire is too commercial or even Scott McFarlane. I think the Boom book has sparked a lot of that because it's just like, oh, Bill and Ted just came out. You know, it's like John Wick 4 is like now being rumored around. It just seems a little too like this was purposely planned around when Bill and Ted was coming out, and there was a lot of promotion around it, and it's kind of like riding the coattails, which is brilliant for Boom and Keanu Reeves to do. It's sure brilliant, and every creator can learn something from that. But I think that's what sparked it. I think it just seems a certain way, but I agree that I do think it's bringing a lot of people in. And even if they don't back your project, they now have a Kickstarter account,
hmm
which is half the battle. And,
I agree.
but I do want to get out of Kickstarter and talk about cons because you attended a few cons before and you were gearing up for them. And I'm curious because, as we know, cons aren't coming back for the rest of 2020. Good chance they're not going to come back for 2021, at least till June. It's looking like, and I'm being very conservative when I say this, and I'm also being very optimistic when I say it. And when they come back, there's going to be massive changes. So I'm very curious what you think needs to happen in the con world and what it's going to look like and what cons need to do as far as being safe for both fans because obviously if you have half attendance that means that that's only half you can market to and also you want to be safe you don't want to get sick but you're an indie comic creator you have to sell your book to somebody it's not DC and they have already sold Batman for 50 plus years so
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you foresee it looking like
Oh man.
how you're going to go and approach it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I really have no idea. I have a she's about to be I have a 1 year old daughter.
So
I
you,
have a
you, you
child
have
and
a real concern about being safe
yeah,
to,
and
to
so
put it
my
bluntly.
Yeah, so like I'm not gonna rush out to a con anytime soon. I think, I think we are gonna see them again. I think they will be a thing. I think I think a lot it's gonna be a little bit different. It's not gonna be as you're at a con, you're shaking hands, you're getting a real personal touch to things. I think there's going to be some level of distancing, whether that's face masks and gloves, or maybe even a plexiglass in between tables. But it's gonna have a different feel. What that exactly looks like, I don't know. I, for one, just for the safety of my family, I'm not going to a big con anytime soon, which just makes me, I have to find my fans online. I have to make my sales online. I have to, put that marketer hat on and figure it out if I want to, get my book out there, and which is fine. I'm learning new skills. I'm not going to be perfect at it. I'm still learning, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and now talking about that, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to start practicing those skills right here, right now. I know you got something else that you're working on. So, what is that? Also, where can people find you on social media? Where can people pick up Man of Sin to check out the complete graphic novel? Because I still think it's relatively new. With that, it's less than a year old at this point. So, whole book, you get the whole story. It's 90 pages. It'll take you maybe 45 minutes to an hour to read it, depending on how fast you read it. You might want to read it again because it's one of those books that you might miss certain things. So, where can people find you on social media? Where can people learn about your projects that you're creating? Twitter, if you got a Twitter, you got an Instagram. Don't know if you got a TikTok. I don't have a
No TikTok.
TikTok, but if you do, feel free to share. I'd love to see you doing some crazy dance moves on TikTok. Just saying.
No one wants to see that. uh, yeah. So I actually have two projects coming up in the next 2 months. First, I'm in a horror anthology with a really awesome artist. Her name is Donna Black. I believe you can find her work at like donnaBlackArt.com. She's an Irish artist. She kind of has like a I think it's Dave McKean, the guy who did Arkham Asylum with Grant Morrison. She kind of has like that style. So we're doing an 8-page short, and it's called The Nightmare Theater. It's going to be on Kickstarter in October. And then I am my next full length series is called Forgotten Hymns. That will be on Kickstarter in November, and that's a Lovecraftian thriller. It kind of deals with again, kind of this. It's about. I really like to deal with trauma, apparently. And so this is it's a Lovecraftian thriller about a billionaire Harris who is trying to cover up her father's conspiracies, or her father's like wrongdoings, her father's crimes, and in doing so, she uncovers kind of this occult, dark, deep secret that her family's tied to. So it's a lot of Lovecraftian monsters and that sort of stuff. So that comes to Kickstarter in November. Uh, if anyone wants a free comic book, I'm giving away Man of Sin issue 1 for free digitally. You could find it at aguilde.com/free comic, and you can pick it up. So it's AGUILD, as in David, E as in elephant.com/free comic, and you can pick that up. You can follow me on Instagram. I believe it's A Guildy. I'm gonna check. I don't Instagram myself that often. Um, yeah, it's A Guildy on Instagram, uh, and that has you'll see teasers of both the projects and upcoming art. Or you can follow me on Twitter. I don't use Twitter a whole lot. I'm mostly a Facebook guy, but Twitter at Andrew Guilde, one word on Twitter. But yeah, you could if you go and get that comic, you could sign up for my fan list, and every Friday I release a top 5, as well as I give behind the scenes looks at some of my stuff. You get up to date on all the projects. You get I try to get free stuff out all the time. So yeah, that's where you can find me. That's kind of what's coming down the pipeline. Really excited about it. Working with some great artists, and I got Ben Templesmith to do a variant cover for me for Forgotten Hymns. It's an awesome cover. I can't wait to reveal it.
And I don't know if you mentioned it already, but you should mention again. Where can people pick up Man of Sins?
Yeah, for
Man
the
of
whole
Sin.
book, Man of Sin right now, the graphic novel's on Amazon. You can just go to Amazon.com and look for Man of Sin, or you can get it digitally at Comixology. It's on Comixology as well. So Amazon, Comixology, or you could just shoot me a message on any of the platforms. I'm pretty accessible. If you want one, I'll be happy to get you a book. Send it to you personally.
Well, there you go, everybody. So this is we're going to wrap up there. But before we do, and I say it every single episode, definitely if you got extra cash and you're not needing the money and your family's good and everything's good, you're good. Throw money at those projects that he mentioned and Andrew mentioned already that are coming up, as well as if you want, pick up Man of Sin, Amazon, Comixology, email him, he'll get you a book. And that's only if you have extra money. If you don't, please take care of your family, please take care of yourself. Make sure you're good before somebody else is good because times are tough, and I'm the first person to understand that, as well as a variety of other people are. And if you can't afford it, there's no excuse now not to support anybody on social media. That's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Shoot him a message, ask him for TikTok because we all want to see those dance moves, man. We all want to see
No
them.
one wants to see it.
So it's the future. It's the future. Sales are going to go right through the roof. But in all seriousness, if you can't afford a book, you can get the first issue for free if you sign up for the email list. You'll get a bunch of access, and that's extremely important, as well as social media is so important right now. And social media is free, so there's no excuse anymore that if you like what you heard or you're interested to support somebody on social media. The only excuse you have for not doing that in today's age is if you don't have internet or electricity. And if that's the case, please shoot me a message for two reasons. A, I want to know how you're watching me because there's a business opportunity and I want to make money and you will make money and we will enter a partnership because obviously we have some technology in front of us that we're both going to get rich and become trillionaires. And also, I would like to help you by entering a business opportunity because clearly that's the only excuse if you don't have electricity or internet. Otherwise, follow on social media, support indie comics, support indie creators. It is so important right now, and it is just as important as throwing money to comics and throwing money at books that they create. Because social media, I can't emphasize it enough, is crucial in today's age.
I agree. I agree.